Thank you for joining us today on Friday of what has been a very, very busy week indeed on the climate negotiations front. If you've been following closely, maybe you've seen that methane has been one of the headline-grabbing events here at COP26. And we're joined today by the methane hunter, James Turittto. James, pleasure to see you. How are you doing?
It's good to see you, John. I'm doing well.
So obviously, for those of us who've been following it closely, the methane pledge was something that was kicked off in September. Since then, it's had a snowball effect. We now got over 105 signatories to it. But you've been following it a lot longer. Just talk us through your experience.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the methane pledge itself is an exciting thing to see. Just this week, we have 105 countries that have signed up to pledge to reduce methane emissions over this decade. When I look at that map, though, I realize there's a lot of work ahead. It's exciting that there's all this optimism about what the countries are going to do. There's a lot of regulations that we're going to need to get together around the world to actually get going on the methane pledge. So a lot of work ahead with it.
So just talk us through, where did your journey specifically start? What's your background and how did you get into following methane around Europe?
Yeah, so I joined the Clean Air Task Force Super Pollutants team last year and came to Europe with a camera in my hands and started to look at and research the oil and gas industry in Europe. We're using this camera here, the FLIR GF320, to identify and document source of methane emissions across Europe. The EU is currently in a legislative process debating and discussing a strategy to reduce methane emissions. And so we wanted to really kickstart that debate by documenting emissions and showing Europe that, there is also a problem here.
So you've been to 12 countries, I think, over the course of, 6 months?
Yeah.
And you visited 250 sites. I mean, just talk us through a little bit about what you've seen on that tour.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind tour the last 6 months. I've been to production regions in Romania and Germany and Austria, looking at oil and gas wells. I've looked at compressor stations throughout Europe that are transporting gas across the continent. I've been to storage facilities, and what we've been seeing is that there are leaks and fugitive emissions and venting and flaring events everywhere we go. Every single country we've been to, we've seen a lot of emissions. There's methane coming out of all of the facilities. Most of the facilities I've been to, I'm going to find some sort of emissions.
And just to perhaps state the obvious, but why does methane matter? I mean, for me personally, probably a year ago, if you'd asked me about methane, I would have known that it comes from cows, probably has some kind of climate changing effect. But why is methane important?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone around the world knows that methane also comes from cows, right? But methane is 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And so it is a powerful global warming pollutant. It is the main component in natural or fossil gas. A lot of people don't realize that it's methane that's coming out of their stove or heating their homes. And when it's released into the atmosphere, it has a huge effect on global warming. We've seen and now have documented evidence from the IPCC's latest report that methane is responsible for 0.5 degrees Celsius of the 1.1 degrees growth we've seen in global warming. That is a huge part of the problem. And yet, no one's been thinking about or talking about methane really up until this year. We've seen a lot of momentum around the engagement for methane and addressing methane in this year, and it's really culminated with the Global Methane Pledge. I mean, Clean Air Task Force has been working on it for the last 20 years, trying to really get it out there and talk to people about it, but there wasn't a lot of attention on it for a long time.
And I think it's important to state, partly because there wasn't a lot of attention on it, that it's not really been something that's very easy to quantify, and there's a lot of gaps in the data, right, about where methane comes from, how much of it is being emitted.
Huge gaps in the data. Better research is coming out. The problem is that unlike carbon dioxide, where it's kind of coming out of the combustion source, where something's being burned, methane is leaking all along the supply process. So from the oil wells and the production regions all the way to your home. So along that process, all along the whole chain, methane is leaking out. There's fugitive emissions. And then there's also operational emissions. Companies are just venting it into the atmosphere and flaring it off when you see those large gas flares going off in oil and gas regions across the country. There's methane coming out of those facilities as well.
I mean, obviously, technology is developing very rapidly now. We saw earlier this week we're going to have a special observatory set up to analyze exactly where methane's coming from. It's going to use satellites. I've been working in my reporting quite a lot with using satellite imagery, but it only tells part of the story, right? There's still a lot of gaps where satellites just don't cover. Could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So, to reduce methane this decade, we're going to need every tool in the toolbox. Satellites are going to be great. They're going to tell us so much more about what is going on in the world that we don't know now. We're going to have a number of different satellites looking at methane emissions. We don't have any satellites currently that were designed to look at methane. But it's only going to show us about 50% of the emissions that are occurring. And we're going to need other tools, such as a tool like this camera that I've been using around Europe, but also, we're going to need drone measurements and aerial campaigns as well. There are a lot of different tools to study methane emissions, and we're going to need all of them.
Before we talk about the camera, I just want to ask, is this an expensive problem to solve, curtailing methane emissions?
It's not an expensive problem. The IEA says that we can reduce methane emissions in the oil and gas industry by 75% using the technology we have and at negative to marginal costs to the oil and gas industry. So the question is, why hasn't this been happening yet? And what we need, though, is what we're seeing, though, is that these companies aren't actually doing it, and there need to be regulations to push them.
Get this camera out, James. I think we'd all love to see it. Talk us through what it is, why it's important, and just a little bit about it.
Yeah. So this is an infrared camera. You've probably seen infrared pictures before. But it is specially calibrated to see methane. Methane is an invisible, odorless gas. But methane absorbs infrared radiation. And so using this camera, which is calibrated to see the spectrum with which methane is absorbing infrared radiation, we're able to look at a site and see if methane is coming out of any parts of the facility.
And it's important to note this is an industry standard camera, right? Energy companies have these; they can use them to track their own emissions.
Yeah, absolutely. This is used by the oil and gas industry. It's recommended by the EPA, and it's starting to be recommended by regulatory agencies around the world.
So you took this to a compressor station, for example. Just describe the process. You point it at a compressor station, and it shows you exactly where gas is being leaked into the atmosphere.
Yeah, and let me explain what a compressor station is first,
because
please. I know a lot of this terminology, but I know a lot of people don't. The way I like to think about compressor stations is that they're like the little beating heart of a gas transmission system. So the pipelines are the veins, and the compressor station is just pumping the gas through. So it recompresses the gas, and then it continues down a flow through the pipeline. So there's a lot of gas going through a compressor station. And that's why looking at Europe, where you have so much imports, Europe's the largest importer of oil and gas in the world, where you have so much gas flowing through the continent, I knew that there were going to be a lot of compressor stations. And that's where we needed to target to look at where there are emission sources. So I've been looking at gas compressor stations as one of many oil and gas facilities in Europe. And usually when you go to them, they're pretty large facilities with a lot of equipment. And I just kind of walk around them and take a look. You have these emergency vent pipes and blowouts where, they're only supposed to be used in the event of emergency. And oftentimes what I'm seeing out of them is that gas is just coming out on a regular basis. They tell the environmental authorities that it's really just for maintenance. Routine maintenance happens for 5 or 10 minutes. But I'll be on site for 30 minutes, an hour documenting this. I'll go back to those sites days, weeks later, months later, and it's still happening.
So I reported on Romania and using some of your footage.
Yeah.
Romania is very interesting, right? Because it's one of the biggest gas and oil producers within the EU.
Yeah.
Obviously, as you just said, the EU gets most of its energy from outside of the EU. Could you just talk a little bit about what you saw in Romania and why it was so shocking?
Yeah. So, as you said, I mean, it's one of the largest oil and gas producers in the EU. And what was the most shocking thing about Romania is that I didn't actually need the camera to show what was going on there. I think that the digital photos I took from Romania were the most compelling and the most scary. I mean, we saw oil storage tanks with large rusted out holes on them. In some cases, the roofs were just completely collapsed from rust. And they were still in use. You know, I would point the camera on it, and I wouldn't actually be able to see much methane coming out because it was being diluted so much with the air, you know. But I was talking to the site engineers, and like, yeah, we're still using them. The infrastructure in Romania is quite old, and there's a lot of emissions there. There's you know, the gas companies saying, oil and gas companies saying they're making upgrades, but they have a long way to go to really reduce methane emissions. And then, you know, there aren't many regulations in the country either. That's why the regulations at the EU level are going to be extremely important to get through. We really need tight regulations on the oil and gas industry in Europe to then make sure that member states aren't polluting.
And it's important to note there that your work had a real impact, right? I think we spoke to OMV afterwards, and they said due to some of the footage that we had showed them that they were going to address some of the leaks on their facilities, both in Austria and in Romania.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. You know, I've spoken with OMV too, and they want to know where things are happening. I tell them where it's happening. We publish all of the videos that I take and put them online, and you can see where the sites and the dates that I was there. And I'm telling OMV, I'm telling the gas companies what I'm seeing. You know, we really need to reduce methane emissions, and we can't do this necessarily if the oil and gas companies are not actually playing a role in this. But you know, we'll see. I mean, I fully hope and plan to go back to Romania in another, 6 months or a year. I suspect I'll probably see the same thing going on. So we really need to see these companies move quickly. And that can only come with really policy environment, like regulations, enforcement. So you want to see there needs to be action both at the government level and with the companies that are pushing the companies to do that. I'm happy to bring you out to Romania. Too,
yeah, I'd love to go. Let's go. But yeah, it's important to note as well, though, that it's not just a problem that's perhaps confined to rusty, leaking containers in Romania and Europe's east. But I mean, your most recent trip was in the UK, right? And you saw similar things, possibly even worse.
Yeah. What I saw in the UK was scary. Apparently, the environmental agency is allowing the oil companies to just cold vent gas into the air. This is significant quantities of methane annually being emitted into the air from wells that are barely producing any oil. I mean, I don't understand why they're actually keeping these wells alive, because it's not the offshore gas oil production. It's not some of the larger facilities. It's very small quantities of oil that are being produced, and yet the impact on the environment is massive.
And so what's been the general reaction that you've got, not just from companies, but from activists on the ground?
I mean, it's been amazing. I wouldn't be able to do the work that I'm doing without the support and help from so many people around Europe. I've met hundreds of activists in Italy, Germany, UK. I'm kind of motivated by them. I'm in awe of how much motivation they have to keep going day in and out to really, really drive the campaign home. It's impressive, the work that they're doing. And I love just kind of meeting so many people across the continent to talk about this issue. And they've really begun to take up methane as a serious issue at the local level. And they want to use these videos to file complaints. The problem with that is that there aren't the regulations. Even, the agencies, the regulatory agencies will say, that's not a problem. We don't know. It's not illegal, right? But the local activists really want to drive this campaign further and take these complaints and file these complaints with the authorities.
Well, let's talk a little bit about regulation. The EU is going to come forward with some methane legislation. We're expecting it in December 14th to be precise. What do you think we need to see in that legislation?
Well, there's a few things we need. We need a strong leak detection and repair program. We need required monthly inspections at these facilities. The gas companies need to be inspecting the facilities on a regular basis and reporting that information back to the regulatory authorities. We need to see a ban on routine flaring and venting. I've been seeing flaring and venting going on. You've seen the videos, right? There's a lot of venting going on. The companies are saying, we're not venting, this is maintenance, or something along those lines. They're venting. It's happening in Europe. And we need to ban it, right? It can't continue. Import standards. The problem is not just in Europe. We're using this camera as an advocacy tool to document what's happening and to raise the awareness, because it's cool to see these images. I mean, it's impressive, and you're like, oh my gosh. But, Europe is the largest importer, and many countries around the world where they're importing gas, Russia, Algeria, the US, have significant problems with their methane emissions. We need tight import standards that are going to reduce those emissions from those production regions. Europe needs to stand up as a leader to make progress on this issue.
And I guess it's particularly pertinent right now when gas prices are at record highs. Europe is getting gas from Russia. Nord Stream 2 is just about to open. I mean, talk a little bit about why now is a crucial period.
I mean, it is crucial. Gas prices are an all-time high, but we don't have any time. We need to act now. We don't have any time to waste on this issue. If we can reduce methane emissions and cut methane emissions this decade, we're actually going to see tangible progress on slowing the growth in the rate of warming in the next 2 to 3 decades. This is something that you and I will be able to see in our lifetimes, and it will be a major achievement. There aren't that many positive things to look into often in the climate world, and this is something that really everyone should take up and see, and work on, because it can make significant progress in slowing the curve and then allowing us to make progress on other areas, closing down, reducing carbon emissions elsewhere, and figuring out some of the technologies that are going to take a couple more decades to really mature.
Before we did this interview, you told me that you'd only spent something like 3 weekends at your home in Berlin. I was just wondering if you could give the listeners some tips about spending life on the road. I mean, how did you stay sane during your travels?
Yeah, I think I'd have to go back to all the people that I meet and the local activists who are working so hard, throughout Italy, throughout Germany, throughout the UK. They inspire me, and it's so exciting to see them working. And really, I kind of grow off that energy, too. It's certainly been a lot of travel over the last 6 months. I'm gonna try to take some months off, maybe, if my boss allows me to do that. But no, it's been tiring, but also very fun. And honestly, it's been important, right? The imagery, thanks to you and taking up this issue as well and writing about it, we've been able to show what is going on in Europe with these methane emissions. And I think, it's just incredibly important to raise that awareness, and that also inspires me to keep going.
Because I think, just to be blatantly clear, you were spending most of your nights in a van, right?
That's correct. I was driving around in a camper van, living methane van life, I guess. And I've been, I took my first trip 3 weeks across Italy, and in a van with my wife. I somehow convinced her that she was going to be able to work on this road trip, which did not turn out to be the case for her. I got a lot of work done. It was very productive. Found a lot of emissions in Italy, which we were all very surprised about what was going on. And since then, it just seemed to be the best way to travel. I have a lot of equipment that I need to travel around with me. So, yeah, I've been kind of living in this van for the last 6 months, going back to Berlin when I can to refuel, rest, and see my wife from time to time. But it's been good.
So after a few months rest, where's next?
Well, I mean, we've still got to continue raising awareness in Europe about this. I mean, we can continue to show these images to people, but it's not until we take, more journalists out, politicians out, regulators. They all need to see what's going on and to think about ways that it can be stopped. So I don't want to give out too many hints about where I'm going next, but I'll certainly let you know when the time comes. There's still a lot of emissions going on throughout different countries in Europe that I haven't been to yet. I want to revisit a lot of places that I have been to, because it's important to make sure and show that this is continuous. It's not just one-off events. These are continuous events that are happening throughout the countries, and it's important to report on that.
Well, as of the last count, Russia is a big absentee. If you go there, let me know.
You want to come with me to Russia? Because I don't, if you want to come to Russia and you can make sure that we don't get, into too much trouble. But I don't think we're, unless we get a formal invitation, I think we'll let the satellites do some of the documentation of the Russia work.
Great. James, Turittto, thanks very much for your time, and let's hope we get some more methane signatories over the next week or so.
Great.
Thanks
very much.
a lot, John.
Thank you. Appreciate it.